Hello, Internet. I'm Jackie Fox, and today we're going to be talking about red states, Republican voters, and how our understanding of these two things affects the way that we see the current protests that are happening across the country. So, first off, I want to explain that I'm not making this to defend the conclusions that these people are coming to. But I think that it's crucially important that we begin to understand and have empathy for how they are coming to these conclusions. A really good question that I have been asking myself for a while is why Republican voters continue to be conservative and farther to the right, even though they are predominantly working class, and why leftist ideals don't seem to appeal to them, even though we speak and offer better solutions for the working class than corporate Republicans tend to. And I think that a big part of that is a messaging issue that I'm going to get into a little bit later. And in order to fix that messaging issue, what we're going to have to do is have empathy and understand why they're coming from where they're coming from. Boy, this whole intro just fell out of my head. I am so sorry, y'all.
Oh my lord.
Oh my Lanta. I think it's important that we don't conflate Republican politicians with Republican voters, because when we get angry in the comment sections on social media, we tend to just use those things and those ideas interchangeably, and we tend to talk about Republicans as a whole group. And this is kind of weird to me that we do this, because aren't we the same sorts of people that are often talking about how you shouldn't overgeneralize and lump a large group of people into a similar group? I mean, one of the things that we're talking about here is how we often caricature these people as just a bunch of idiot racists. And while you could definitely make the argument that, I mean, just looking at the policies that they put in place, that Republican politicians are a bit racist in the way that they design this, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the reason that their voters are voting for them. I mean, if you went out and voted for Joe Biden over Donald Trump, would that mean that I could safely assume that you voted for Joe Biden because you like rapists? No, I don't think that's a safe assumption. There's a lot of people that are making that decision because of the lesser of two evils. But what you have to understand about why these people might vote for Trump is that maybe they see it the exact same way, but that because of where they live in the country and their lived experience of politics over the last couple of decades, they might see a different choice as being the one that is the most evil. So to really understand why they might think this way, we have to go way back in time. We have to go back all the way to my childhood, to the presidency of Bill Clinton and the proposal of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. When NAFTA passed, it moved a lot of jobs out of this country. A lot of them went to Mexico. A lot of these were factories that were the bread and butter of a lot of Midwestern economies. These same Midwestern states that went overwhelmingly red for Donald Trump in 2016. Their economies were hollowed out in ways that still haven't been adequately addressed by any level of policy from either side of the field. And a lot of the solidly stable middle-class jobs that those factories once offered them have been replaced by gig work and service industry jobs that pay them minimum wage. And because they live in red states, and because Republican politicians are just kind of inherently horrible, they don't have access to the same kinds of social safety nets that we do here living in blue states, or at least closer to cities, like a lot of my audience probably does. So that's how it started with NAFTA. And you also have to understand that this built a really big association with them of the Democrats are out to screw us over, and B, just this real hatred of Clinton in general. And that hatred seems to have transferred itself really easily to Hillary herself. But you also have the problems that were introduced under Barack Obama's presidency. Things that furthered this idea that the Democrats were out to get them specifically. things that made them think of the Democratic Party as the greater of the two evils, even when, from our perspective, it may seem blatantly obvious that this seems to be true of the Republicans and not the Democrats, even if we don't fully support everything that the Democrats do. Now, why is it this way? Why did so many Republicans seem to have a bitter hatred for Barack Obama? Is it because they don't like black people? I'm sure that's true for some of them. But again, you would be overgeneralizing if you think that the entirety of the reason that they disliked Barack Obama is because they're racist. So let's look at the real reasons that that might have happened. Let's look at Barack Obama's first impression to the American public, the 2008 bailouts, and how those specifically affected rural red communities in the Midwest in ways that they didn't necessarily affect us living near cities on one of the coasts. For one, the banks that got bailed out in 2008 were the biggest of the banks. Those small community banks that they probably had in Midwestern cities and towns, those didn't get bailed out, and those were allowed to fail. So all of a sudden, their local banking institution that was probably run by locals that were a lot more, a lot more charitable to them, got replaced by a heartless corporation like Wells Fargo, and overdraft fees became a multi-billion-dollar market. This disproportionately affected people living in those red Midwestern states. And they remember that, and they hold it against the Democratic Party. A lot of those places have food deserts, and a food desert is a place where you're not going to find a grocery store, you're not going to find, like, fresh produce. Your best shot might be a gas station. But equally bad, they also have financial deserts, where they might not have a bank, or they might not have a good bank. They might not have a good local bank that treats them right. And if they don't, and when you combine this with, trade agreements that have sold their jobs to other countries, their economic disadvantage turns them to have to rely on what are essentially legalized loan sharks in the form of payday advance places that have popped up all over the country, but especially in economically depressed portions of the Midwest. So that just added insult to injury for them. So then we move into 2016. And for all the bad things you can say about Donald Trump, he certainly did a lot of talking about bringing those jobs back and reversing those terrible trade policy ideas. If there's anybody who could be a single issue voter, it's these folks. And their single issue is reversing the damage that was caused by these trade policies. In the same way that a lot of Democratic voters are willing to look past the fact that Joe Biden is a rapist in order to vote against Donald Trump, I think a lot of these people were willing to look past the fact that Donald Trump is kind of a blatant racist and a horrible person because he was talking about that one issue that was so singularly critical to their lives. So how does all of this play into the reopen protests that are happening now? And how can understanding this help us understand how they've come to a conclusion that seems just horrible to all of us? Yeah, I'm sure that there are some people out there who are just protesting their right to get a haircut. Idiots exist everywhere. But you got to understand that the media does a really good job of demonizing protesters on either side of the field. And this might be what they're doing now. It seems a lot more likely to me that a lot of these people have a completely different reason for being out there than what we're being told. For example, because of all of the things that I've laid out so far, these people are in a really bad economic situation. They can't afford to stay home from work. They're looking at it like this. If this virus has a chance of killing me, that's a chance that they're willing to take because it's a sure death to stay at home and starve with your family. That's not a chance that they're willing to take. Another thing that you have to understand is that viruses like this, yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of affecting our memes and the way that we understand this. It's kind of filtering down so that even those of us that don't really watch this media, we get these talking points refed to us or kind of reserved to us through the way that it affects people who create content and the way that they present that content. But back to the point that I was making, because of population density, And because blue states tend to have better access to community health care or food banks or all these type of situations, actually that's kind of a separate point. Because of our better access to medical care, nope, still a separate point. Okay, purely because of our population density, this is hitting cities and areas of concentrated populations a lot harder than it is places where populations are far more spread out, like these Midwestern states where we're predominantly seeing these protests. So when they're used to the media gaslighting them on so many things, it's really easy for them to look at this and say, maybe it's not as bad as they're saying in New York. And it's really easy to say that if you don't have any friends that have been affected by this. And with us living near these cities where this virus is really taking hold, it's really hard for us to understand how that perspective could exist when we do have friends that have been affected by this. But we can't allow that to just shit all over our ability to empathize with these people, because they're facing a lot of the same working class problems that we are. And if we ever want to be able to do outreach to these people, we have to empathize and understand where they're coming from. We can't just caricature them as people who just want to play golf. We have to understand that these people see themselves as fighting for their lives, that they may understand that this is a bad situation to go out and protest during a pandemic, but they may see it as their only good option. And another thing, you know, a person like me, I can very comfortably say we shouldn't be out here. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a really big one in this whole thing, the idea of population density. That's really why it's so easy to peddle the idea that this is a hoax to people like that. I mean, it absolutely isn't. Don't get me wrong, but it's easy for them to feel like it is. And I still don't think it would be a good idea to reopen these states, because even though it's spreading slower, it's still going to spread and it's still going to have disastrous effects on them. So they need to stay the course just as much as we do, but it gets a lot easier to peddle a false narrative of this being a hoax to them. And I got derailed again. I really need to get better at doing this stuff live and not getting derailed by this. But I guess the bottom line here is that we need to make a conscious effort to understand what other people in this big country are experiencing. Because, I mean, here's a thought experiment. Think of us like the European Union. Think of each state as a country. Would it be accurate to say that people in Sweden or the Netherlands have the same lived experience as the UK or Germany? No, that seems obviously wrong. The cultures are very different, the places are very different, the individual government that really affects their daily lives is very different. So why can we assume that the same things that we seem to see as reality here in North Carolina are the same things that they would perceive in Wisconsin? It just doesn't make sense. And if we can't cross this mental hurdle, we will never be able to do effective outreach as leftists. So if there's one idea that I want you to leave you thinking about as this video comes to a close, that's it. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope I see you next time.